All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you again. Thanks for joining us for part 2 of our webinar. Just a couple of quick notes here before we start. I'm Jesse Stife. I'm the president of the Reading League Florida. I'm really excited to bring you tonight's session, Teaching Foundational Skills, What, Why, and How. Just a couple of announcements before we get right into it. I want to encourage everyone again to keep up with the Reading League Florida on our various websites. The main way we communicate with folks is through social media. So you can find us on Facebook at the Reading League Florida or at TRLFL. So please follow us there if you're so inclined. You can also follow us, or you can also find us at fl.thereadingleague.org or on Twitter at the Reading League Florida. So while you're on our pages, I encourage everyone to consider making a donation. Your donations help us keep the lights on, help keep the free, high-quality sessions like this coming. We're all volunteer. We're a 501c3 organization, and so no one's making any money from this. And every dollar from donations goes right back into the organization. So our aim is to keep all of our content free and publicly available, since we never want money to be a barrier for professional development. For tonight's webinar, we've opened up the Q&A function, and we welcome our live folks here to ask questions during the presentation. Our presenters will take some questions at the end. And all right, so lastly, it's my pleasure to kick it over to Drs. Valentina Contesse and Holly Lane of the University of Florida Literacy Institute. Thank you again for your time here, and please take it away.
Thank you, Jesse, and welcome everyone. Let me go ahead and share my screen. There we go. All right, so as you may know, this is the second in a three-part series sponsored by the Reading League and the University of Florida Literacy Institute. So at this point, we are on this webinar. We have another one coming up. We'll talk a little bit more about it. And I saw Matt Burns join us, and he will be the one leading the next one on December 13th. We will remind you of that at the end, but just want to make sure everybody knows. Also, the recording for the first in the series is already posted on YouTube, and that one was an overview of foundational reading skills and how they fit into a multi-tiered system of support. And so we encourage you to go back and watch that recording if you missed the live webinar. So tonight's focus is on actually teaching foundational reading skills, and we're going to be addressing the what, the how, and the why. And we're going to just take you first through a little quickie review of some of the main content from the first one that is essential to understand what we're talking about next. But that doesn't let you off the hook. You should still go back and watch that first one. So if you're not familiar with UFLI, it stands for the University of Florida Literacy Institute, and our work resides at the intersection of teacher development and reader development. And so most of what we do is helping teachers become more effective so that their readers become better readers. We are going to be referring quite a bit tonight to materials that are available for free on the UFLI Foundation's Toolbox. We are also going to be having a digital handout that's available in the chat. Valentina will be posting that link for you. And the link to the toolbox, as well as some other resources, can be found on that digital handout. So to get us started, we talked last time about the idea of the science of reading being simply an accumulated body of evidence that comes from a number of different fields. So in particular, psychology and linguistics and neuroscience, as well as education. And unfortunately, most educators are very familiar with the education research, but not as familiar with the other areas. And all of those really contribute to our understanding of foundational reading skills and how we should be teaching them. So we're going to be sharing some of that with you tonight. So there is quite a bit of evidence about how children learn how to read. Of course, you're familiar with the National Reading Panel report. I hope you're also familiar with the IES Practice Guide on Foundational Reading Skills. there is an enormous body of research specifically about teaching children how to read and spell words and how to read connected text. And all of what we're going to be talking about comes from that body of research. So we hope that you're familiar with the simple view of reading, this idea that reading comprehension is the product of decoding and linguistic comprehension. Our focus is going to be on the D side of this equation. So it's not everything that you need to know in order to produce proficient readers. It's literally just half of the equation, but it is critically important. And so we want to make sure that children learn to read and spell words early and well. If you're familiar with Scarborough's rope, same kind of idea. We are addressing the word recognition components of the rope. Last time, we also talked about Aries' phase theory of word recognition development and how important that was. And that is part of what we will be addressing, really how to get kids from the pre and partial alphabetic phases into the full alphabetic phase. That's really the main focus of early foundational reading skills work, teaching kids how to do that letter by letter decoding in order to then become more automatic and consolidate those skills to become proficient. So one of the things that we talked about last time that is going to be in your digital handout is the phases of Aries phases of instruction, and the idea of how each phase has things that you should be doing, and each of these things that you should be doing in the instructional part of this table are intended to push students along into the next phase. We need to keep that in mind, that because a student is in a particular phase, it doesn't mean we need to be teaching them to that phase. We need to be teaching to the next phase to move them along in their development. We also are framing all of our content across these 3 webinars under a framework of multi-tiered systems of support. We know that all students should receive high quality core instruction or tier 1. Some students will need supplemental supports or tier 2. And if those things are done well, you should only have a few students needing intensive intervention or tier 3. The idea here is that if your core instruction, your tier 1 is effective, you won't have that many kids needing intervention. So effective tier 1 instruction should meet the needs of around 80 to 85% of your students. If it's not doing that, then we need to really look at tier 1 and how we can make it better, because it's not good enough if it's not meeting most kids' needs. Our favorite saying for this from Michelle Elia in Ohio is, you can't intervene your way out of a tier 1 problem. You've got to address high quality tier 1. So we're going to be talking a lot about tier 1. We will also be talking a little bit about intervention and how these things apply for kids who are struggling. So when we're talking about instruction and intervention, it's really important to understand that for foundational reading skills, instruction needs to be both explicit and systematic. So it needs to be clear and direct, unambiguous. It also needs to be logically sequenced. So you're teaching simpler concepts before you teach more complex concepts, and you're building on prior knowledge. One of the key elements to effective instruction is ample opportunities to respond or opportunities to practice the skills that you're working on. So last time we talked about this in a little bit more detail, but one of the key elements of good foundational reading skills instruction is that you're providing a lot of interleaved practice. So traditionally, a lot of foundational skills tend to be taught in blocked practice formats, where you do a lot of practice of a skill until you reach mastery, and then you move on to a new skill. But what cognitive psychology research has shown us is that interleaved practice of similar skills actually leads to better long-term retention. So the idea here is that you are able, when you're learning in an interleaved practice kind of fashion, you're able to refine your understanding of each skill or each concept, and you're through the comparison with the other interleaved skills that you're practicing with. And that comparison and constantly going back and forth actually helps lead you to better long-term retention. So when we're planning practice, if we want to keep coming back and reviewing skills over time. We also want to make sure that the practice that students are getting is high quality practice. So we want to provide ample opportunities to respond, but we want to monitor to make sure that the responses students are providing are correct. And when they are correct, we want to let them know they're correct. That's when we provide behavior specific praise. When those responses are incorrect, we need to provide corrective feedback. So again, all of these things were addressed in the first webinar. So if you want to get a little bit more in depth with those, go back and watch that webinar. So effective instruction is all of those things that I just mentioned, but effective intervention is also all of those things. It's explicit, systematic, with lots of opportunities to respond and appropriate feedback for those responses. But effective intervention is also one more thing, and that is, it is intensive. And when we say intensive, we're referring to smaller groups or even individualized instruction. We're providing more opportunities and more targeted practice. And we're doing this with over more time. So kids get more time during the day. They might spend a little bit more time on a skill over several days, with the idea that we're creating a more intensive instructional environment. That's the main distinction between instruction and intervention, is that intervention is more intensive. When we're talking about increasing intensity, it's really just providing a lot more practice. Kids who are struggling to develop a skill need more practice to get good at it. So one thing to keep in mind is that that practice should be with the same kind of instruction. Again, if your tier 1 instruction is effective and meeting the needs of the majority of your students, the students whose needs aren't met with that core instruction generally just need more practice with the same instruction. So there's a big tendency to have kids get different programs for tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And we would argue that that's not the best approach. It's much more effective to provide a really strong tier 1 program and then give kids more opportunities to practice the skills that they're learning in that tier 1. When you have different programs across tiers, what tends to happen is you have a different scope and sequence with each program, a different way of explaining foundational skills. And so your most vulnerable students are also then ending up as the most confused students, because they're trying to sort out different ways of learning. And that's just not a healthy approach for that. So what we suggest is that when it comes to teaching foundational reading skills, differences among the tiers should be quantitative, not qualitative differences. That means they get more, not different instruction. So effective intervention is intensive. We also want to make sure that the person providing that intensive instruction is the person with the most skills. So we want to make sure that it is a teacher doing this, not a volunteer or a paraprofessional who has less training. We want to have the person with the most expertise providing instruction or intervention for your students who are struggling the most. So effective intervention, explicit, systematic, intensive, ample opportunities to respond, and appropriate feedback for those responses. So within a multi-tiered system of support, we also talked about last time how important assessment is. That's how we determine who needs extra support and how much support they need and what they need support with. We talked about various purposes of assessment. So this is going to be the focus of the next seminar, the next webinar on December 13th with Matt Burns. And we will, again, remind you about that at the end, but learning about how to use assessment to make data-based instructional decisions is a really critical piece of effective multi-tiered systems of support. So getting into our content for tonight, we want to start with the road to fluent reading. We introduced this idea last time, but the idea here is that children come to school knowing some things, and we want to capitalize on that knowledge and build on it. So children have experience with spoken language, and they have some experience usually with written language. Ultimately, what we're most interested in early on with foundational skills instruction is what they come knowing about sounds and letters. So some children come with minimal or even no knowledge about letters, but a lot of children come with a lot of knowledge. And just from being involved with spoken language, they're playing with sounds in some ways. They're learning about sounds as they're learning how to speak. And so what we want to do is when kids enter school, we want to see these two roads merge. And we want to teach them the connections between sounds and letters, or between phonemes and graphemes. So we're going to refer to those as grapheme phoneme correspondences, or GPCs. GPCs are really the first piece of foundational skills instruction. Once kids enter kindergarten, we want to start teaching them how these phonemes and graphemes work together. And as soon as they know a few graphemes and a few phonemes and those correspondences, we want them to start learning how to read words. So as soon as you know that A spells a and that T spells t, we want you to be able to put those two things together to read the word at. And then you can learn S spells s, and now you can read the word sat, and so on. So we don't want to wait until children know all of their letters and all of the sounds that go with those letters before they start reading words. We want them to read words right from the beginning, because that helps them understand why they're putting all this effort into it. They experience some immediate success. They start to see themselves as readers early on. As soon as they know a couple of words, they can start reading connected text, and we want them to have practice with that. So if you just know a handful of letters and their corresponding sounds, you could read a sentence. It might be a simple sentence like Pat sat, but it has meaning. It's something you could draw a picture that depicts how Pat sat. So we want to make sure that kids have opportunities to read something that has meaning, excuse me, from the very beginning. Through all of these phases of the road, we want to develop both accuracy and automaticity. So we're going to be talking, when we're talking about how to develop automaticity as well as accuracy. So when we're talking about automaticity, ultimately, what we're talking about is getting kids to the point where reading words, spelling words is effortless. We want them to not have to think about it like we do with something like driving. Excuse me. When we were learning to drive a car, when I learned to drive a car, I had to think really hard about which of those pedals makes the car go, which of those pedals makes the car stop. That was really important, and I had to focus on it. I had to think about how to steer, how to turn the car on, how to turn the car off. I was learning how to drive on a stick shift. I had to learn how to shift gears. All of those things took a lot of mental effort at first. Now, when I drive, I don't even think about any of that because it's so automatic. And I can actually get from here to there and not even remember the trip because I was talking on the phone or I was listening to something on the radio. I can focus on something else. And that's what automaticity means, is that you don't have to put any conscious effort to the task that you're doing. And so for me, driving is a great example. You might have learned to play a musical instrument. You might have learned to play a sport, but with a lot of practice, you get to the point where you're automatic with those skills. And that's what we want for our students when it comes to reading. So when we think of a less fluent reader, what they're doing is very laboriously trudging through words. They're trying to decode words, and that takes all of their cognitive load, all of their effort. Their mental effort is focused on figuring out the words. That means they don't have any cognitive effort left to devote to comprehending what they're reading. When a child becomes more automatic with word reading, they're able to really not pay much attention to it. It doesn't take much conscious effort at all. And that means they've got lots of working memory, lots of their cognitive effort left to devote to understanding what they're reading. So we're going to be referring to automaticity a lot because that's really important. We don't want to get kids just accurate. We want to get them to the point where they don't have to put any effort into it anymore. So we're going to be going down this road, and we're going to be starting with talking about sounds and letters, and then we'll talk about each of the elements along the path. So when we're thinking about sounds and teaching children sounds, we're talking about phonemes. We want to teach kids the sounds that are used in speech and that we connect with print. And we want to think about those individual sounds, because that's how we get to that point of being able to make the connection with graphemes. So as educators, we probably all learned at some point that phonemes are the smallest unit of sound in spoken language. And that's absolutely true. It's an accurate, but it's an incomplete definition of the word phoneme. Linguists, the people who study phonemes, think about phonemes as both that sound that we're hearing, but also the physical act used to produce the sound. So what's going on in your mouth is the phoneme. So way back when phonemic awareness was first really thought about as something connected with reading ability, Isabel Lieberman, one of the very first researchers who made this connection, she talked about phonemes as articulatory gestures or as vocal gestures. And somehow that got lost in translation to education. We quit really paying attention to that part of the phoneme. The idea that it's not just what we're hearing, it's what we're doing to make something that we can hear. So that's an important element here that I think is really important for teachers to understand, is how important it is to become aware of what your mouth is doing. So if phonemes are both the smallest unit of sound in spoken language and the physical act used to produce the sound, that means that being phonemically aware means being aware of both the sound and your mouth movements, what your mouth is doing to produce that sound. So that might be a different way of thinking of phonemic awareness than what we're used to, but it's an important distinction that we need to help children become more aware of how they're producing sounds. Now, work with articulatory gestures in reading instruction is not about improving articulation. Most of our kids, they're developing their speech capacity pretty well. That's not usually a problem. What we are developing isn't the ability to speak or to say the sounds, it's the awareness of what you're doing while you're making the sounds. Most of us don't really think about that much, but we usually are more aware than we think. And we want to make sure that kids become aware as well. So understanding when you see a mouth in a particular shape or making a particular movement, you can tell what that is. So we call these movements articulatory gestures or vocal gestures. And the idea here is that making students aware of how sounds are produced strengthens their phonemic awareness, but it also supports their decoding and encoding skills, especially their encoding skills. If you are able to pay attention to what your mouth is doing, you're going to be better able to represent those phonemes because you're more likely to get the correct phoneme. So for example, if you are spelling a word and you're not sure what you heard, you can't detect the difference in the sound because a lot of the phonemes aren't very distinct from one another in terms of the way that they sound, but they feel very different. So an example that I like to use is the word bath. So a lot of kids will pronounce it bath, and they may even spell it that way. But if we teach them to pay attention to what their mouth is doing when they're saying bath and making sure that they're pronouncing it the correct way, that will help them know how to spell the word more effectively. So we want kids to pay attention to the position of their lips and their tongue, to pay attention to the mouth movements, and to pay attention to whether the sound is voiced or unvoiced, whether we talk about their sound, their voice being on or off. Are your vocal cords vibrating when you're saying that sound or not? So when you look at mouth pictures, you can usually tell what sound or what group of sounds a particular mouth is probably producing. So the lips together is probably a or a p or a b. Those are the only sounds that humans make that in English that use that particular mouth position. The one on the right with the teeth on the bottom lip, we know is either going to be a or a z. Those are the only sounds that are produced with our top teeth on our bottom lip, and so on. So we know these things because we are aware of what how we're producing these phonemes, but little kids aren't always aware. And so helping them become more aware can really accelerate their progress. The same thing with vowels. Vowels are a little trickier because the distinction between vowel mouth positions is less distinct than the positions of what you're doing when you're producing a consonant sound. But it does help to learn about your articulatory gestures. So in the UFLI Foundation's toolbox that we mentioned earlier, if you go to the printable resources section, you can find all sorts of materials that have these sound wall pictures, and these are all downloadable for free. We encourage you to visit that and get your own copy of these. So you can have individual sound charts, and you can also have sound wall cards that you can print and put up on your wall. When we're talking about sounds, we also need to be careful about how we're pronouncing sounds. So you're probably pretty aware of this idea that we need to be careful to clip sounds or not to put a big schwa sound after a consonant. So if I'm saying that B is ba and G is ga and I is I, would read this word and it would come out ba-iga, right? And that does not make sense. And when kids are taught sounds that are not blendable, they tend to do these kinds of things. So we need to be really careful about how we're modeling the sounds. So instead of saying a ba for a B, I think about how I say the sound at the end of a word. So I'm never tempted to say caba. I can cut the word cab off really pretty easily at the end. And so I just say that word and repeat the final sound. So I'll say cab, b, b. That's a good pronunciation of the sound for B. Or saying big, I don't say bigga, I say big, g, g. So I can produce that sound if I think about how it sounds at the end of a word. But being really aware of how you're modeling sounds is really important. We have a resource that is linked in your digital handout that is just a video of yours truly going through the letters of the alphabet and modeling a blendable sound for each one of these. And some of these are a little bit different pronunciations than you may be familiar with. So in particular, the ones that most people are surprised about tend to be the W and the Y and the QU. So W, instead of saying "wh" or some variation of that, I think about how I actually say it at the beginning of a word, like wish. I don't say "w-ish," I say wish. And so that's how I'm going to teach kids that to pronounce the sound for W. For Y, I don't say ya ear, ya ello. I say yellow, year, yes. It's that y sound. And so those are the kinds of things that we just need to be really careful about to make it easier for kids. If we're modeling blendable sounds, that's what they're going to use, and they're going to be able to. So when we're teaching phonemic awareness, we need to think about really two skills. We want to teach kids how to blend and how to segment. So these are really the only critically important skills for kids to develop as they're learning to read words and to spell words. So for blending, what you're doing is providing the individual phonemes in a word like f, sh, and ask students to put those together to get to the word fish. One of the things that is recommended is that you can support this development of this skill by modeling connected phonation. And so what connected phonation is when you have a word with a continuous sound at the beginning, you can hold out that sound until it kind of bumps into the medial sound, and hold out the vowel until it bumps into the final sound. So instead of saying sh, I'm going to model it as fish. and get kids to then blend it together. So they can say those sounds and put those sounds together and get to the word much more readily. And a study of this particular strategy found that even though we can only do this when there's a continuous sound at the beginning that we can hold, that even when kids go to read a word with a stop sound at the beginning, maybe they're blending the word dish. When you say d-ish, they can put that stop sound on better if they've been taught connected phonation with continuous sounds. So it's a really effective strategy. The other element is segmenting. The segmentation of sounds is usually a little bit more challenging for kids than the blending of sounds. For segmenting, you're modeling by providing a word, and then the kids will say each sound in the word. We use our fingers to count out the sounds. That tends to be really helpful. So if I say shin, the students will say sh, Blending sounds helps kids get ready to decode words. Segmenting sounds helps kids get ready to encode words. Those are the skills that they're using when they're doing those more advanced tasks. So there are a lot of phonological skills out there, but really the only ones that are important for reading words and spelling words are phoneme blending and phoneme segmentation. We don't really need to worry about rhyming or syllable segmentation before kids get to phonemes. We want to start them right away into phoneme level work and not pay attention at that point to the larger units. That is something that we learned through a lot of professional development over the years, that kids first do word level and syllable level and then intrasyllabic units and all of that. And what we really found out over the years is that phoneme segmentation and phoneme blending are the things that matter. Those other skills don't lead to better word reading and spelling. So they're really not worth spending our time on. The other thing that is really important to think about is the use of letters. So way back in 2000, when the National Reading Panel report was published, they recognized from the very beginning that phonemic awareness with letters is more effective than phonemic awareness without letters. So the idea here is that we don't do phonemic awareness instruction for the sake of improving phonemic awareness. We do phonemic awareness instruction to help kids get better at decoding words and encoding words. And so this is a really critical piece, because just doing phonemic awareness orally improves oral phonemic awareness. You do get better at doing those skills, but it doesn't transfer as well to decoding and encoding words as when you have letters. So we were probably, all of you were taught at some point that phonemic awareness is without letters, and once you add letters, then it becomes phonics, and you've got to do them separate, and that just never made sense. The idea, even 23 years ago, we already knew this. This was already very well established even then, that when we're talking about developing phonemic awareness, when we can incorporate letters into that instruction, it's going to be more powerful. And it's going to lead to the goal more quickly. Kids are going to be able to read words and spell words more effectively. So let's talk about letters. When we're teaching kids about letters, we need to understand what they know. And when I hear a teacher say, oh, this child knows his letters, I really want to ask, well, what do you mean when you say this child knows his letters? Because there's so many different ways to know a letter. You can have knowledge of the letter name. I can ask you, what letter is this? And you can tell me that's an A. I could also maybe put out a whole lot of letters and say, point to the letter A. Which one is the letter A? Those are two very different skills. One is generating the name, and one is just picking it out from an array of letters. So generally, just given a handful of letters like this, identifying which one is A is going to be easier than coming up with the name of the letter yourself. But for some kids, the opposite may be true. but these are different skills. Both are considered knowing letters, though. We also can ask children, what sound does this letter make? So does the child know, for example, that A represents the sound A? Okay, well, that's knowing a letter sound, but do they also know that it can represent the sound A or ah or There's a lot to knowing your letter sounds. So we can know our letter names, we can generate those names, we can point out the letter with that name, we can generate a sound, we can generate a bunch of sounds. We also want to know, well, can the student form the letter? And writing the letter involves knowing where to begin, which direction to move, and where to end up. All of those are critically important elements of letter formation, and letter formation is a really important way to know a letter. So these looping GIFs are something that we use in UFLI Foundations to model letter formation for kids over and over again, because if we leave kids to their own devices and just give them a printed letter and say, write this letter, chances are really, really good that their formation of that letter is going to be incorrect. And so once we've modeled it for kids, we want to circulate and make sure that what they're practicing is correct. And we're going to be providing behavior-specific praise if it is, or corrective feedback if it's not. But while we're circulating, we can have this model showing up on the board so that they can have something to look at to make sure that their formation is correct. We also want to make sure that kids can recognize names with the names of letters with automaticity. So rapidly naming letters is a good indicator of your ability to recognize those letters. It's your indication of automaticity with your alphabet knowledge. But all of these are ways to know letters. So as we go down this road and we know something about sounds, we know something about letters, what we want to do next is combine those into our grapheme phoneme correspondences. And I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and let Valentina take over and talk to us about grapheme phoneme correspondences and words. If there are any questions at this point, you can certainly put those in the chat as well as we're shifting roles here.
There was one question in the chat, Holly, if you can address it. So one of the participants asked about lowercase versus capital letters and whether there was any helpful instructional guidance about the order in which you introduce them, all capitals first, lowercases first, the utility of capital versus lowercase. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, the idea there that's generally recognized among the people who actually study alphabet knowledge is that uppercase letters tend to be easier for little hands to produce. That's one of the reasons that most kids learn uppercase letters first. We don't spend a whole lot of time on uppercase letters. We introduce the strokes, the letter formation strokes, through the formation of uppercase letters early on, but we don't spend a lot of time on that. We don't expect mastery of that. It's less important overall to have mastered that early on, but it's a really good way to learn the basic strokes. So we do subscribe to that idea that starting with uppercase helps kids learn how to make horizontal and vertical lines and slanted lines and curves and all of that. So starting for that reason with those uppercase letters and then moving right into and putting most of your effort in practicing lowercase letters seems to make a lot of sense. There's a little bit of, back and forth about this, but that's usually what people who study this will tell you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That's very, very helpful, as always.
Sure.
All right, so moving on now that Holly has talked about sounds and letters, how we're beginning to bring that together for students by teaching them grapheme phoneme correspondences, or GPCs. And as Holly mentioned, we'll discuss building both accuracy and supporting automaticity with grapheme phoneme correspondences in our session tonight. So in talking about grapheme phoneme correspondences and teaching these to students, it's important to understand that, as Holly mentioned, phonemes are those, the smallest unit of sound, and that articulatory gesture, that physical act, and that graphemes are the written representation of those phonemes. But what makes our English language really complex and challenging for students and young learners to learn is that most graphemes are made up of more than one letter. So if we're looking at this example of the word sheep, we know that sheep has 3 phonemes or sounds, sh, e, and each of those phonemes are represented by a grapheme. But in just this one example, we see that the grapheme SH is made up of 2 letters. The grapheme EE is made up of 2 letters, and then the grapheme P is an easy one. So the importance of looking at an example like this is that we need to make our instruction really explicit in order for students to really learn grapheme phoneme correspondences and the letters that make up these complex grapheme phoneme correspondences. In teaching grapheme phoneme correspondences, it's really important that we do this in a systematic way. As you heard from the first webinar, that's a key feature of explicit or effective instruction, it being explicit and systematic. So this is an example of the scope and sequence in UFLI Foundations, which lists the concepts from simple to most complex. And so we see here that students begin by learning simple grapheme phoneme correspondences like the letters of the alphabet, but pretty quickly begin to learn those more complex graphemes like we see here with digraphs, long vowels, our controlled vowels, and then the end of the scope and sequence focuses more on morphemes. So again, whether it's this scope and sequence or a different scope and sequence, it's important that we build students' understanding of grapheme phoneme correspondences by doing it in a systematic nature, going from simple to most complex. When developing accuracy with grapheme phoneme correspondences, it's important that we include very explicit introductions to these concepts that provide different information related to what students are learning. So something that's really important related to explicit instruction is helping students connect the new concept that they're learning to a previously learned concept. So if we were teaching students the grapheme phoneme correspondence for SH, it's helpful to connect it to something that they've already learned. So based on our scope and sequence, CK is a grapheme phoneme correspondence that students have already learned. So again, we're explicitly connecting this new concept to one that they've already learned by saying, you have already learned about a consonant digraph. We have talked about CK. When C and K are together at the end of a word, they make one sound. After that, we want to, again, explicitly show students that graphemes are made up of individual letters. So we may say the consonants S and H have their own sounds. But when these consonants come together in words, they make one sound, sh, like at the beginning of the word sheep. So once again, here we showed students explicitly that that new grapheme SH is made up of 2 letters, and reviewed that separately they make different sounds, but together they make one new sound, which is sh, and connected it with a keyword, like we see here, sheep. Another important part of developing initial knowledge and accuracy with the grapheme phoneme correspondences is talking about the placement of this grapheme phoneme correspondence. So SH is an example of one that can go at the beginning or end of a word. So if we were teaching these to students, I might say the consonant digraph can come at the beginning of a word, such as the words ship and shop. And the consonant digraph SH can also come at the end of a word, such as fish and wish. So again, we showed students how that concept would be applied, how that grapheme correspondence would show up in words, either in the beginning or either in the beginning or the end of a word. It's important that we also use example words, of course, as we are discussing these placements of the grapheme phoneme correspondences. As Holly discussed, articulatory gestures are also a very helpful part of learning new phonemes, but also discussing the connection between these phonemes that they know and graphemes. So articulatory gestures are an important feature of introducing new grapheme phoneme correspondences, and after discussing that articulatory gesture, connecting it to that grapheme. So students connecting that sound and how it's made, that physical act with the grapheme. All of those resources that I just mentioned are found on the toolbox for the different concepts or grapheme phoning correspondences on the UFLI Foundation scope and sequence. So based on whatever lesson you're on, you would find a specific PowerPoint that includes lots of resources, but one in particular is that example that I just showed for grapheme phoning correspondence introductions, like we saw with the SH example. That was a little bit of discussion related to developing accuracy with grapheme phoning correspondences. So now we're going to discuss building automaticity with grapheme phoning correspondences. So after initial introduction and application and practice with this new grapheme phoning correspondence, it's important that we're supporting students' automaticity. And so we want to ensure that we're reviewing grapheme phoning correspondences that we're teaching students. A strategy that can be used in your classroom instruction to support with building automaticity of grapheme phoning correspondences is a visual drill. This is a helpful practice that can be used to reinforce, again, those grapheme phoning correspondences that have already been introduced explicitly and practiced initially with students. The goal of a visual drill is that students eventually are able to automatically recognize that grapheme and link it to the phoneme, and that they build, again, that more and more automaticity with that, which will support their decoding or reading. For example, if we showed students a grapheme CK, they would respond by saying CK spells K. So connecting again the grapheme with the phoneme, so saying the letters and the sound. And this can be done with single letters. As Holly mentioned, blendable sounds are a critical part of students' foundational reading skills instruction. So as students are doing or responding during a visual drill, it's important that teachers are providing feedback related to the sounds that students are producing. Another thing that gets asked a lot is whether it matters if students respond to this type of activity by saying F says or F spells. And our opinion is that it doesn't matter as long as students are connecting the grapheme with the phoneme, and again, using this activity for building automaticity. So we're seeing students become quicker at being able to respond with both the grapheme and the phoneme. Just like you saw in those examples for the visual drill, you would be displaying a grapheme either on a slide or a card, and the students would respond by saying the letter and the sound. Throughout any program that's teaching foundational reading skills, students will begin to learn additional phonemes associated with the grapheme. So they would be producing all of the phonemes that they've learned for that grapheme. And an example of that is the letter C. So students initially learn that C spells K, and then later learn that C can also spell S. So when they saw C in a visual drill, they would respond by saying C spells K and C spells S, or C spells K and S. Again, the important part is that they're connecting those graphemes with the phonemes that they've learned so far for those graphemes. In addition to having slides available on the toolbox, we also have printable grapheme cards of different sizes that may be helpful both for whole group instruction and small group instruction for engaging students with this activity. Another activity that can be used to build automaticity with grapheme phoning correspondences is an auditory drill. So like the visual drill, this is another activity that helps reinforce students' grapheme phoning correspondences. And again, the goal is building automaticity, but now they're connecting the phoneme that the teacher is presenting with the associated grapheme or graphemes that they've learned. So now as a teacher, instead of showing a grapheme or presenting a grapheme, you are presenting a phoneme or sound. And the student is having to represent that sound with whatever grapheme they have learned or graphemes they have learned. It's important that students are writing the graphemes and again, connecting that sound now, that phoneme with that grapheme. So you would say the sound, ah, the students would repeat it, ah is a, as they write. Both of these activities, again, are helping strengthen students' knowledge of graphing phoning correspondences and building automaticity with these. The auditory drill is also really supportive of encoding or spelling, because students, in order to spell a word, have to be able to identify sounds in a word in order to represent with graphings or letters. So for both of these drills, as I already mentioned, it's really important that students are producing blendable sounds, but also that we are modeling blendable sounds. In the auditory drill, you are presenting those sounds to students, and students are repeating those sounds. So it's important that we're modeling the sounds in the most blendable way. So making sure if sounds are continuous sounds that can be stretched out, like ah, that we're modeling that. And also, as Holly described, making sure that we're not adding schwa to those stop sounds. It's also helpful to assist students in attending to those articulatory gestures as we are providing feedback during these two activities. So moving along our road, now that we've talked about graphing phoning correspondences, of course, when students learn these, as Holly mentioned, it's critical that they begin to apply them in words, both reading and spelling words. And again, thinking about building both accuracy and automaticity at the word level. So as we think about these activities that I'll refer to, it's important to think of back to Aries phases of development and thinking about how our instruction and the support we're providing students is for the purpose of moving them to the next phase. So Linnea Arie talks, according to Linnea Arie, learning to read and learning to spell are one and the same, so almost two sides of a coin. So these processes are should not be taught separately. Both are really critical to developing foundational reading skills and readers, proficient readers, and they support each other. So in instruction, we should be providing students both decoding and encoding opportunities with the graphing phoning correspondences that they're learning. So when we're talking about decoding, this is when students or anyone translates print into speech. So in order to decode, students need to have phoneme blending skills. So when they look at a word, of course, we care that they're able to say the sounds, but unless they blend the sounds and say cat, they're not truly decoding or reading. So our instruction should support students decoding and blending of the phonemes in order to read words. As Holly mentioned, doing phonemic awareness blending activities is a great warm-up for decoding or reading words. When we talk about encoding, this is the opposite. So this is translating speech into print, which requires phoneme segmentation skills. When students want to encode or spell a word, they need to be able to hear the whole word cat, hear the individual sounds, cat, and then represent each of those sounds with the grapheme that they know to represent that sound. So that's a C, that's an A, that's a T. So again, in order for students to be able to encode, they need to be able to segment phonemes that they hear in words. Another important concept is orthographic mapping. So the purpose of decoding and encoding instruction that we're providing is to promote students' development of this mental process called orthographic mapping. So the activities that we're doing in our classrooms should be supporting this process. So orthographic mapping is the formation of phoneme graphing connections to secure spellings, pronunciation, and meanings of words in memory for instant recognition and retrieval. So through the process of orthographic mapping is how words become sight words in our vocabulary. So if we're thinking about the word frog, if we wanted to encode or spell that word, we would hear that whole word first, frog, hear each individual sound, frog, and then for each of the sounds we hear, represent that with a letter or groups of letters like we see here in frog. In order to read the word, it's the opposite process where we're looking at each of the letters and saying all of the sounds, frog, to get to the whole word frog. So as you can see, this is why both encoding and decoding types of activities are supportive of orthographic mapping. This is a process that occurs with regular words like we saw with the word frog, but also with with more complex words like we see here with the word fish. So in fish, when students hear the whole word fish, they hear the sounds sh, and in order to spell that word, they have to remember that that sh sound is represented by 2 letters, sh. And so again, that's where going back to that explicit introduction to graphing phoneme correspondences is so critical, because they have to be able to remember that even though they only hear that one sound, it's represented with 2 letters. The same occurs if they're reading this more complex word fish. When they see sh, they have to remember that it's not 2 separate sounds, that it's one sound, sh, in order to get to the whole word fish as they are reading. This process is also occurs when we're reading and spelling irregular words, like in the word said. So if we were reading the word said here, students or adults would have to remember that I spells in this word. That part is irregular, but still they're able to use sounds in order to get to the full word said. The same thing if they were spelling the word said. If they hear the whole word, when they get to the sound, they have to remember that that is represented as AI in this word. That's that irregular part of the word. So now we're going to talk about different strategies for teaching decoding and encoding for the purpose of supporting students' orthographic mapping. So first, we're going to talk about accuracy, building accuracy with words. So the most important part of beginning to build accuracy with reading and spelling words is making sure that we are providing explicit instruction and practice with words with the graphings that the students have been learning. So this is done by first providing teacher modeling reading words and then guided practice with reading words, but also guided practice with spelling following teacher modeling. So a lot of times in our classrooms, we jump straight into practice, both guided or independent practice, without a really explicit teacher modeling example. So going back to the features of effective instruction, it's really important that we're providing both teacher modeling and guided practice with the concepts that students are learning. When we're doing modeling, with concepts, it's important that we're showing students explicitly how we apply the concepts. So for example, if we had just learned the new grapheme phoneme correspondence SH, in order to model with that concept, I would say, okay, watch me read. I'm gonna say all the sounds, shed, shed. I said each sound and I put the sounds together. Are you ready to try some with me? And then I would guide my students through practice with other words that have that new concept. The same is true when we are helping students with encoding or spelling with the concept. First, we want to show them how we would encode or spell with that new concept. For example, if I was spelling the word shin, I would show students with my whiteboard in my classroom or in my small group how I spell the word shin. So I might model saying, okay, I'm going to say the whole word shin. I'm going to say each sound shin, shin. Now I'm going to write the letters that I hear. That's SH. My next sound is sh, that's I. And then we hear that's N. So let me read my word, shin. So I'm explicitly showing students that first I'm saying the whole word, hearing each individual sound or phoneme, and then representing each phoneme with a grapheme. And then I also modeled reading the word after I have spelled it, which are strategies that we want students to use as they're writing words, again, both through guided practice and independent practice. But again, really important that when supporting accuracy with decoding and encoding, that we're providing both teacher modeling and guided practice. So now we're going to talk about the strategy of using Old Conan boxes, which is an instructional method that was developed in the 60s by a Russian psychologist that was nicknamed DB Old Conan. It's not Olconian or Elkin or Conan. He was a real person. And so the strategy is called using Old Conan boxes. So Conan described a method that would support students segmenting of sounds or phonemes by moving markers into squares under a picture. So if we were looking at these examples and students had markers for the word key, they would say, again, moving markers for each sound or phoneme that they're hearing. For the word cat, so again, showing students explicitly that one sound represents one marker. And then for the word frog, og. So really explicit way to show students how words are segmented into phonemes. It's a really effective way for supporting phonemic awareness, of course, because students are attending to those individual phonemes or individual sounds in the word. And in particular, again, it promotes phonemic segmentation. So students being able to hear and segment all of the individual sounds in a word. More recently, researchers have added letters to the method. So in addition to using the strategy with markers, we can use this strategy to support students' use of them for spelling or encoding words by embedding letters. So here's an example. So for key, we would have the graphemes that make up key and cat and frog. So the squares are helpful because they're showing students that these are grapheme phoneme correspondences that spell these words. So including letters in this method helps improve students' understanding of the alphabetic principles, so how letters and sounds work together to make words. Of course, they're going to provide opportunities to practice decoding because if the O'Conan boxes include letters, students can also practice decoding or reading these words. And it helps promote orthographic mapping because of the back and forth between segmentation to include the graphemes and then reading the words. So in order to use O'Conan boxes, we like to think of a few steps. The first one is to count the sounds with a student or a child. So for the word fish, we would help them count ish. And when working with students, it's helpful to model this going left to right. Ish. After that, we would draw one box for each sound. So we can say the sounds again as we're drawing the boxes. That provides students another opportunity to hear all of those sounds segmented before continuing on the activity. For younger learners, we can just use markers to help them segment the sounds. And then we can also help them segment the sounds as we move the markers out of the boxes. Once students are ready for it, we can also again use this method to insert letters. So it's helpful when using the strategy that we're supporting students in hearing the sounds and then connecting to the letters. So I might say, okay, what's the first sound we hear in fish? And my students would say, okay, what letter makes that sound? Students say F, and then so we write it in. What's the next sound? I. What's that letter? I. And what's the last sound we hear? Sh. What two letters make that sound? That's right, SH. So again, very explicit way to show students how the phonemes that they're hearing are connecting to the graphemes and how these different grapheme phoneme correspondences fit in these boxes. It's important then when using O'Conan boxes, we're also showing students how to write the whole word under the boxes. Again, we can say the sounds as students are writing, fish underneath. And last, we would want students to read the word to practice decoding. And again, so encouraging them to say the sounds, ish, fish. Here's a few other examples of words. So the word fish had that grapheme phoneme correspondence SH. In the word dig, it's another one that is pretty simple. In the word male, we see that vowel team AI is taking up one box. And O'Conan boxes can even be used with multisyllabic words like we see here with the word teacher. There is a handout with much more details related to using O'Conan boxes in your digital handout. Now we're going to talk about using manipulative letters to support both decoding and encoding. So in math, we are used to using manipulatives to make abstract concepts more concrete for students. And in reading, we can use manipulative letters to make abstract concepts of phoneme blending and segmenting less abstract and more concrete for students. In particular, using manipulative letters for word work, we can use magnetic letters, letter cards, letter tiles, or any other kind of manipulative letter that you have access to. It's important that whenever possible, we make sure that all the letters are of just one color, so that they are associating the letter's identity with its shape and not the color. So if students are getting used to associating a specific letter with a color, that's going to take away from what we want them to focus on, which is the letter shape, especially when students are first learning the letters of the alphabet. Here's some examples of letters that can be used. Again, they can be magnetic letters or tiles or even paper letters. Another thing that you'll notice is that these are lowercase letters. When students are reading words and text, they're likely going to be reading words and text with lowercase letters. So we want to make sure that we're using lowercase letters when using manipulative letters for instruction. On the left, you'll also notice that these sets of manipulative letters or magnetic letters have an alphabet map behind them. This is going to be really helpful for instruction because students will know where to return letters to and where to get letters from. As you can see, they're in alphabetical order, which will make practice with manipulative letters much more efficient. You'll be able to do lots more opportunities to respond in practice when students are able to quickly get the letters that they need in order to spell new words. So when using manipulative letters, we are supporting students, again, the concept of decoding and encoding, making that blending and segmenting more concrete. And so we might tell students to begin by spelling the word sip. So they would move the letters S, I, and then I might say, okay, read the word, sip, sip. Then I might say, okay, change sip to lip. And students know to move the S and change it to an L to make the new word lip. Then I might say, okay, I'm going to add an F here at the beginning. What's the new word? And they would read it, flip, flip. Now we have flip. I might tell my students, okay, change flip to flop. So they would hear that change in that vowel and change the I to an O. What's the word? Flop. Now that they have the word flop, I might say, okay, change that letter that says ah and add the letter that says F. So they're connecting now that they have to take away that letter ah and add the letter that says F, which then they connect it to A. And I say, okay, what's our new word? And they read flap, flap. And then I might say, okay, we have the word flap, change flap to flag. And students would know that that final sound is different and they need to change that P to a G. So as you could say, even though this was a really quick example, that quick example showed you that students were able to use manipulative letters for practicing encoding and decoding, and that we were able to fit a lot of practice in during just a few minutes. The guidelines that are suggested for using manipulative letters are also included in your digital handout. When talking about using manipulative letters for word work, it's important to discuss word chains. So word chain is a series of carefully chosen words that can be used again for both encoding and decoding practice. Here's an example of one where we see we begin with a word sit and change one phoneme at a time to have students practice encoding and decoding various different words. So the word chains can be used to practice, again, both decoding and encoding at different levels of difficulty. So we can see here this first example of a word chain only changes the onset part of the word. So the rhyme stays the same, the add stays the same. So this is a little bit simpler word chain to use for encoding and decoding practice because students are only attending to changes in that initial sound, that onset. Here's another example where it's a phoneme level changes either at the beginning, middle, or end of the word. And so this is a little bit more complex, but we see that students are practicing identifying changes in the medial vowel and also adding S at the end or at the beginning to read longer words. Word chains can also be used with more complex graphemes beyond just the letters of the alphabet, like we see here with an application of that new grapheme phoneme correspondence SH to read and spell words with SH, and also other graphemes that they've been introduced to, like CK. So using word chains with manipulative letters through word work are really helpful for building accuracy with decoding and encoding. And so we want to make sure that our word work practice is providing students practice with both encoding or spelling and decoding. And the type of practice students are engaging in will depend on the directions or the prompts that we're providing them. So if we're providing students encoding or spelling prompts, we're saying things like change sat to hat. When students have the word sat, they have to hear the difference between sat and hat, that initial sound, in order to encode or spell that new word. We may also ask this by saying, what letter do you need to change sat to hat? Students, again, have to hear that difference in that initial sound in order to spell or encode that new word. When we want students to get decoding or reading practice, we're going to tell them what to change and ask them to read that new word. So if the students had the word sat in front of them, I might say, change the S in sat to an H. What word do you have? And I've told them to change that letter, and their practice now is decoding or reading that new word that they have. I can use letter names to make these types of changes, but also I can tell my students the sound that they need to change, like change the S in sat to a read your new word. This is a little bit more complex because students now have to connect that sound to the letter that they need to change in order to read their new word. Here's a quick example with our new concept that we learned, SH. So we can see that our word chain includes shin, to ship, to shop, to shock. And I might ask first for my students to spell that initial word, shin. So they might use their manipulative letters or tiles to spell that word, and that's practicing, again, spelling or encoding. Now that my students have the word shin, I might say, okay, change that N to a. Students do that. They connect that N is that N, change it to a P, which is P. They've done that, and then I ask them, what word is this? And students read ship, ship. They've practiced decoding or reading that new word. Now that they have the word ship, I might say change ship to shop. So again, students have to hear the first word ship and then shop and hear the difference in that medial vowel. They make that change and they're practicing encoding or spelling that new word shop. They had to hear the difference and spell that new word. Now that they have the word shop, I might say change the P to CK. We wait for students to do that, and then we ask, what word did we spell? And students read shock, shock. So now students are practicing decoding. So with the short example, the short word chain, we saw again that students were getting practice both encoding and decoding words with that new grapheme phoneme correspondences. And that as much as possible, we were alternating to ensure that students were getting practice with both of these skills. So there's a lot that makes word chains really good or not so great. The first one is that word chains should only change one phoneme at a time so that we're gradually helping students read and spell new words. So here's an example: from sit to pit to pig to dig to dip, only one phoneme changes. A bad example of this is changing more than one phoneme at a time. So we see this here right away, going from sit to sap. Both the medial and ending sound change. So that would be really difficult for students and not a great way to use a word chain. Another thing is that we want to stick with students practicing one pronunciation of a grapheme. So here's a good example of that same sound for that grapheme OO versus going changing the sound that is focused in that word chain. We don't have a ton more time tonight to talk about word chains, but there is a link to a word chains video that will, if it's not already on your handout, will get added to your digital handout. So now we're going to quickly talk about a strategy and a method that can be used for building automaticity at the word level. This is called a blending drill, which is intended to reinforce students' ability to decode or read words, more specifically to blend the sounds together to form words. And again, just like we saw with the visual and auditory drills, the goal of this is building automaticity, but now for students to use their knowledge of graphing phoneme correspondences to build decoding automaticity. Here's a quick example of how a blending board could be used to help students through a blending drill to, again, build automaticity in decoding. So we would need a word chain like this, and you'll see in the clip that the teacher is making the words and the student's focus is just reading or decoding the words. So if the teacher was building these words, I would then read it, ought, og. You get the idea. Again, as a student, I was just practicing decoding. I was focused on looking at the letters, blending the sounds in order to read the word. So when using this tool, this blending board app, it's important that only the teacher is doing the manipulation and the clicking of the tiles in order to form the words that we want our students to read. We wanted to really quickly show you that there are UFLI apps available on the toolbox. The ones on the left are WordWork apps that can be used for word work, so helping students both decode and encode words. And the one on the right is the Blending Board app, which is used just for practicing decoding, specifically for developing decoding automaticity. And there is a tutorial for the virtual blending board because it is a little bit challenging to get to know, but once you learn about it, you'll love it. It's a great tool that makes that blending practice really efficient in your classroom. And now I'm going to stop screen sharing and see if there are any questions. I can see that some asked for the handout, which is great. And we also linked that IES practice guide at the bottom. And now Holly is going to wrap up our discussion of the road by discussing application in text.
Thanks, Val. So we learned a lot about reading words, and we want to make sure that kids, as soon as possible, get into reading connected text. And that can be sentences or even just phrases where we combine words to make meaning. But probably the most common way that we use text is reading passages or books. So it's important to think about why we want to focus on connected text. And really one of the reasons is so that children understand why they're doing all this hard work. Why should I bother learning how graphemes and phonemes connect and how to read words? The idea is always to get meaning and to learn things or to enjoy things. We want to give them access to connected text. We also know that if we want to build independence, students need to apply the skills in context with our support in order to prepare them to apply those skills without our support. And finally, context actually does support word reading. Context has gotten a bad name because a lot of ineffective practices do things like teach kids to guess based on context. That's not an effective practice, but all good readers do use context to figure out words. If you are reading something like Mom put jam on the breed, well, that's a great decoding of that word, but it's the wrong word. And the context is what tells us it's the wrong word. And the context is what's going to tell us, oh, that must be bread. Mom puts jam on bread, not on breed. And so you're able to use context in that way after you've attempted to decode. So we want to make sure that kids get practice doing those things with our support so that they're going to be able to do them without. When we're talking about what kind of text, generally beginning readers use controlled text in order to focus them on the right things. We have different kinds of controlled text. What's most common in schools is level text. Level books controls text based on things like the word count, the amount of picture support, and the predictability of the language patterns. None of those things really matter a whole lot to actually learning how to read. Decodable books control text based on the decodability of the words and their alignment to a particular scope and sequence. And decodable text provide lots of opportunities to practice newly learned grapheme phoneme correspondences. So here's a couple of examples, just excerpts from a beginner level book and a beginner level decodable book. The idea here, if you look at these two different sets of pages from these books, are there elephants at the zoo? Yes, there are. Are there giraffes at the zoo? Yes, there are. I could cover up the text of that last page and you could probably tell me what it says. Are there lions and tigers at the zoo? Yes, there are. You don't even have to look if you understand this language pattern. And so that's not really reading, that's guessing based on context. So that's not what we want kids to do. Once we get past these early levels, the pictures and the other things, the predictability of the text is much less supportive and is much more effective for giving kids practice. A beginning decodable book, Bob got the toy rat, he put it in a big bin. Will the big bad bat see the toy rat? Will the big bad bat get the toy rat? I'm interested. I want to know what's going on here. There's actually a lot more of a story to this particular book than there is to the level book here. But this is decodable based on a particular scope and sequence where children have learned these letters and these sounds up to this point. Also usually along with some irregular words. So we use our scope and sequence to organize our decodable passages according to this particular scope and sequence. If you're using a different phonics program, the decodable passages or book should align with their scope and sequence. And it's important that when you're using decodable text, it does provide lots of opportunities to practice what you've just learned, but also to have other opportunities for that interleave practice of things you've previously learned. These are examples of the decodable passages that are available for free on the UFLI Foundation's toolbox that we linked in the handout. And you can see how they start very, very simple and they get much more complex, much more demanding, and with a lot more grapheme phoneme correspondences represented. Those are available in that same lesson resources section that we showed you earlier. And there is a decodable passage for each of the skills. A lot of teachers use these. Also, you have kids illustrate the passage to provide a comprehension check. Sometimes they'll label what their illustration shows. They may highlight the words that contain the new grapheme phoneme correspondence, or sometimes just the grapheme phoneme correspondence itself. But there are a lot of ways to use these for reading and rereading in order to build accuracy and automaticity using these skills. In these examples on the left, you see this little guy actually put a beginning, middle, and end sequence to illustrate what his story. So he showed a lot of comprehension there. And the child on the right got really into labeling everything in their picture. So that gives kids an extra opportunity to practice encoding words. So the decodable passages can be used in a lot of ways. We have on the UFLI Foundation's toolbox a decodable text guide. That's another place where you can find all of our decodable passages. The concepts that are listed in our scope and sequence are in the first column, and then the next column has to our decodable passages. But it also has a lot of publishers. I don't even know how many publishers we have listed now, but other publishers of decodable passages and books where their materials align with our scope and sequence. So it's a good way to find other decodable book sources. But if you're using UFLI Foundations, it shows you where that particular publisher's materials align with our scope and sequence. So you can find that on the Foundations toolbox. You can see where it says decodable text guide. That'll take you right to that Google Sheet. I do want to caution folks, though, is, we do appreciate the value of practicing in decodable text, but we want to make sure that's not all kids are exposed to. A really important part of learning the alphabetic code is learning about the statistical probabilities, the probability that a particular grapheme will correspond with a particular phoneme in a particular instance. So the probability piece, the statistical learning, requires exposure to less controlled text. So if you've just taught that EA represents the sound eh, like in bread, and you have a passage that gives kids a lot of words that practice that grapheme phoneme correspondence, kids will potentially leave with the skewed understanding of how often EA is going to represent the sound eh. That's actually not the most common sound. It usually represents the sound E. But if I get only a whole lot of practice in these decodable passages, I'm not going to really understand what is going to be the most likely grapheme phoneme correspondence in a particular word. So we want to give kids to less controlled text to support that understanding. All of our phonics instruction should include ample practice in decodable text, but we want to make sure that kids also have access to less controlled or even uncontrolled text. So this takes us back to our road. We've taken you down this road, starting with sounds and letters, and then combining those for grapheme phoneme correspondences, words and text. We've talked about how to develop both accuracy and automaticity at each of these levels. So we want to remind you that a lot of these resources are available on the toolbox. You have in the digital handout links to a lot of other resources as well. We will be continuing this discussion of multi-tiered systems of support in the next webinar with Dr. Matt Burns. So we're really excited about that, and we will wrap this up with answering any remaining questions. And we really do thank you for joining us.
We don't have questions in the Q&A right now, and we are coming up on the 90-minute mark here, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and just kind of we'll wrap it up here. And I'll just say, I mean, just a fantastic session, always jam-packed with super usable instructional guidance. I learn new things every time I hear you all speak. So thank you again, Dr. Lane and Dr. Contesse, sorry, for spending some time with us and teaching us about foundational skills instruction. Your work has certainly influenced my practice as an educator, and I know that's the case for educators around Florida and around the country, and now around the world, certainly too. So again, thank you so much. And if you have any concluding remarks or anything else you want to mention before we wrap up, please feel free.
There was a quick question in the Q&A. Holly, did you see it?
Oh,
yeah. So up to what grade can we use UFI? It can actually be used with any age person who needs those particular skills. So the scope and sequence is what guides who it's appropriate for. If you have an older student who's lacking some of the skills that are on that scope and sequence, then it's perfectly appropriate for them. It's designed for core instruction in kindergarten, first and second grade, but we have lots of teachers using it with older students, elementary and even secondary, and even some adults. So it is a pretty flexible program. There's nothing in it that's too juvenile to use with older students.
Right. Well, fantastic. Again, thank you so much. It is 6:30. We do have to wrap it up. Again, thank you again, and we'll see you all on December 13th.
Yeah, we'll look forward to seeing you all again. Take care.